So I suppose I should start by warning that the basic thrust of my talk will be however bad you think things are, it's actually far, far worse. But the optimistic part I don't have time for, so I'll save that for the Q&A. So you will be sadder now when I'm done than when you started, but there is a little ray of hope out there. So when we talk about prison growth and why we are where we are today, you generally hear three stories, or at least I always do. It's the war on drugs, it's longer sentences, and it's this weird amorphously defined prison industrial complex. These are all factors. They're not irrelevant, but they're not actually the things that really matter. It's not drugs, it's violence. It's not time served, it's admissions. It's not the private industrial prison complex, it's the public industrial prison context. Yet despite this, almost all of our reforms focus on drugs, sentence length, and the private sector, not violence, prosecutors, and the public sector. So I want to explain where we are wrong. I think there are ways you can fix this, but again, that's the happy part. I'm not going to get to that now. So let's start with drugs. How many people here, actually, it's a good question, think that about half of all people in prison are in prison for drugs as their offense? All right. So in a recent Vox survey of 2,000 people, 60% of Americans said they thought the percent was half, a majority of people across all political stripes. In state prisons, it's 16%. Add in the feds, it comes to a grand total of 20%. It's not 50. It's 50% of the feds. They are half of all federal prisoners, but the feds are 10% in the system. The states are 90%, and it's 16% in the states. It is not the main driver of incarceration. In fact, if you look at what's caused prison to grow, it's locking up people for violent crimes. 52% of all people in state prison are in prison for a violent crime. And 60% of all prison growth over the past 30 years has come from locking people up for violent offenses. That's where the growth is. Now, why do we get this so fundamentally wrong? Part of it is we've seen the biggest jump in people in prison for drug offenses compared to violent crimes, but that percent change reflects the fact they're not important, not that they are important. But it seems like you've seen the biggest increase in people for drug offenses from something incredibly small to something still small, but the percent change is big, and it makes it look more important than it is. The federal system, despite being 10% of the total population, gets about 95% of the media attention. And the feds do lock people up for drugs and lock them for long periods of time. And people tend to think what goes on in the feds is just what happens, but it's not. It's uniquely idiosyncratic. In fact, I would imagine the two states that are most different when it comes to criminal justice, and compare them to each other, they have more in common with each other than any state has in common with the feds. They're just weird for explicable but depressing reasons. So it's violence. It's not drugs. Now, you might argue the fact that that's too narrow a view, right? To say, well, when I say 60% in prison are in prison for drugs, that's just saying people who are locked up for drugs, right? The person who gets killed in a drug deal gone bad, that's not a drug crime, that's a violent crime. The person who steals because prohibition makes drugs more expensive, that's a property crime, not a drug crime, right? So maybe when I say, well, it's not the war on drugs, well, that's because I'm counting the wrong thing. What I ought to be counting are those violent crimes and those drug crimes, I'm missing the property crimes, I'm missing what's going on. Not exactly clear that's true either, right? So to start with, our murder rate actually peaked in 1979, right? Before the war on drugs, such as it is, kicked off. And you should be clear, there's actually no precise date when the war on drugs starts. And you'll hear Nixon, you'll hear Reagan, both those are wrong. It varies state by state. New York's war on drugs started in 1973, but everyone ignored it until 84, right? Rockefeller drug laws are passed in 73, but people in prison go up until 84, right? So 12 years of Rockefeller drug laws and no change in people in prison for drugs, right? It's a very difficult story to actually tell what the war on drugs is. But the fact is murder actually peaked before the war on drugs really started. The total number of deaths peaked in 91, incarceration, murder rate peaked in 79. A recent book by Julie Yovey called Ghettocide points out that in many ways our view of that drugs brings violence gets causation backwards. Drug markets come to where the violence is. It's not that drugs bring violence in their wake. There's some of it, but it's not entirely the case. If we were to not have prohibition, some crimes would go away and other crimes would go up. We'd have fewer drug-related murders. We'd have more domestic disputes ending in death because of drug abuse. We'd have fewer people stealing money to buy drugs. We'd have more people getting busted for driving under the influence of heroin. Right? And so it's unclear in the end how these things balance out. There probably would be less crime and therefore less imprisonment without prohibition, but not to the extent that sort of looking at how many are in prison for these various crimes would tell us, because a lot of these crimes that happen because of drugs would happen because of other reasons, or this person wouldn't be in prison for stealing for drugs, but this other person would be in prison for DUI for heroin that they're not doing right now. Right? So the total number of people in prison, if we didn't have prohibition, would not be quite as small as you would think compared to where it is today, because legalization brings in its wake all sorts of problems. And to the extent we look at prohibition, capital P prohibition, and all the rise in murder that happened there, two problems with that story. One is that we were urbanizing at the time, right? So things were getting violent just because cities are more violent than rural areas, and prohibition in the 10s and the 20s saw mass immigration into the cities. Also, more frustrating, more police departments were reporting murder during that time, right? So you just had better reporting. We tracked murders better over the course of prohibition. So murder rate went up because we simply had more data on murders. People like to cite Portugal, right? Portugal legalized drugs and saw drug offending go down. But the thing you realize about Portugal, besides the fact that it's a homogenous country of 3 million people, right? So it's smaller than Brooklyn, is to realize that Portugal legalized drugs, passed a minimum mandatory income, and adopted massive, extensive amounts of drug rehabilitation and drug treatment programs. Right? They didn't just legalize everything go well. They adopted 2 other major social programs. So you say if you legalize, look like Portugal, you're missing 2/3 of the story that happened with Portugal. And B, for anything to really happen, legalizing marijuana will do nothing. 1% of prison is in prison for marijuana. 1% are on marijuana charges. Almost no one's in prison for marijuana. And that's all we're talking about legalizing, right? If you want to get people out of prison, 60 or some percent of those who are in prison for drugs are there for crack, cocaine, a smaller fraction in there for heroin, right? That's what you have to legalize. You actually want to get people out of prison for these kinds of issues. And that's not, maybe that's a discussion we should be having, right? But that's not where we can barely tolerate the idea of legalizing marijuana. Moving on to heroin and crack is a completely different question to start having. So if we are going to cut our prison populations back, we have to start asking how we're going to treat people convicted of violent crimes differently. And I point out that mistake I just made is one I make all the time, and I fight actively against every day. Violent offenders. It starts to show why this is so hard, right? That's the wrong word to use. These are not violent offenders. They are people who have committed violent crimes, right? And using the word violent offenders makes it sound like it's a permanent static condition. That if you commit a violent crime, you are and always shall be a violent person. You are a violent offender, except for the giant stacks of evidence up to here showing people age in and out of violent behavior altogether, right? Young people are more violent, then you become increasingly violent, then you get older and you age out of violence, then sometimes you hit your 70s, hormone levels shift again and become violent once more. Which is actually why some people, there are men and old folks who actually become increasingly aggressive when they're in their 70s. It is due to these hormone shifts that explain the same shifts going on when they were 20. The hormone shifts revert back again when they're in their 70s, right? It's a very biological factor to it. We have to focus on violent offenders. Yet in that same Vox poll that found that 6% of Americans did not believe that half all people were in prison for drugs, that same survey found that 60% of Americans, including 55% of liberals to 65% of conservatives, do not want to reduce sentence lengths for violent offenders, even those who pose no risk of future offending. Right? The very thing we have to do, change the way we punish people convicted of violence, is one thing that no one of any political ideology is willing to do at this point. So that's the first big challenge we have to face, is at some point we have to say the easy, non-violent, low-level cases aren't going to get us there. And it's not even just like start with the low-hanging fruit, because we throw the violent crimes under the bus, they pass the other reforms. Right? How do states pass the reforms of drug laws? They jack up their sanctions for people convicted of violence. So South Carolina did it, it's how Maryland did it, that's the rhetoric of it, right? So we save it for those we are scared of, those who are a threat, those who are dangerous. Negates our ability to actually reform where we have to reform going down the line. The second big thing people say it is that causes prison growth are longer sentences. Everyone's in prison for these massively long sentences. They're just rotting away in prison. The median time spent in prison by someone convicted of a drug or a property offense is 1 year, 6 months. The median time spent in prison by someone convicted of a violent crime is 3 years. That's how long people spend in prison, 1.5 to 3 years on average. Now, there are people who spend 10, 15, 20 years in prison, but the fact is, if you look at everyone admitted to prison in 2003, the number still in prison at the end of 2013, 11 years later, the percent of those who have never been released from prison once in 13 years was 3% of those admitted in 2003. I'm really behind. Okay. We have these tougher laws, but people aren't actually being sent to prison for that length of time. What is driving prison growth more than anything else is an increased willingness on the part of prosecutors to send people to prison in the first place. The number of arrests since 1991 has gone down. So we have fewer crimes and fewer people being arrested for crimes. The total number entering the criminal justice system has fallen. And during that same period of time, the number of felony cases filed in state court rose by about 40%. Fewer and fewer people going in, more and more people being filed with felony charges. Once a felony charge is filed against you, the probability you go to prison has stayed flat. Once you go to prison, time spent in prison has stayed flat. So at least since crime started dropping in the 90s, the single biggest driver of prison growth is in the increased willingness of a prosecutor to take an arrest and turn it into a felony case. Now, if you look at every reform bill that's been passed nationwide so far, I can tell you exactly how many of them have actually directly targeted this kind of prosecutorial discretion. None. Not a single one. Not a single state is willing to look at the power prosecutors have. Not a single state has sought to regulate it directly. No, it's not even part of their reform discussion. They're not even discussed really at all. There are lots of different reasons, I think, for this, why this has happened, but we don't really know why, because remarkably, prosecutors provide no data whatsoever. We have the Uniform Crime Reports on crime, the National Crime Victimization Survey on crime, we have multiple prisoner data sets. We have literally no data on what prosecutors do. Absolutely none. And so we're flying blind. We know they drive it. We have no idea what they do, why they do it, how they do it, what their goals are, what their internal policies are, what even just internal, like what drives their decision making. But they are at the center of this entire process. That's not to say longer sentences don't matter, right? Because the Supreme Court says you can threaten anything you want during a plea bargain deal, short of death. Right? As long as you don't invoke death, you're allowed to impose any threat you want. Life without parole or 3 years, that's a perfectly valid threat to make during a plea bargain. So as they create these longer and longer sentences, that certainly gives, the DAs go from showing up to a fight with a knife, now they come with a nuclear bomb. That makes things easier, but they're still aiming for those same short sentences, just grinding more people through for these short periods of time. The last thing to think about is the private prison debate. You hear this a lot, right? The first thing Bernie Sanders did when he wanted to show that he cared about crime was to pass propose a clearly unconstitutional bill to ban private prisons everywhere. Can't tell the states what to do, but he was trying to make a gesture. Hillary Clinton immediately returned all of her private prison money as soon as people made it clear she was getting it, despite the fact that about 6% of all prisoners are in private, 6% of state prisoners are in private prisons, 8% nationwide are in private prisons. It is a vanishingly small fraction of what's going on. More important, the real power doesn't rest with the private prisons. It rests with the public sector, right? There's no evidence that states with private prisons grow any faster than states without. Most private prisons are only in a handful of states. Those states are not necessarily fast-growing states. Some of them are shrinking states. But the public sector unions, that's really where the power happens to rest, right? New York State has had one of the longest sustained decarcerations in American history. Since 1989, New York State's prison population has dropped by about 25, 30%, right? It went from 75,000 to 55,000 people in prison. No one talks about it. We didn't pass any big bills, but steadily from 1999 to today, we've said we dropped prisoners. Yet we cannot close prisons because the New York State Prison Guard Union keeps them open. And if you want to save money on prisons, you have to realize you don't save anything until you start laying off prison guards. 50 to 75% of all spending on corrections goes to salary. It's very cheap to run a prison, but if you can't lay off a guard, you save nothing. Pennsylvania closed 2 prisons, laid off 3 guards. 3 guards. Right? Those are the 3 most effective guards in penological history because they ran 2 prisons between them, or they're very, very good at blocking this. Michigan closed. Michigan's in the process of closing one of its biggest prisons. Yet the article in the Detroit paper made it very clear that the union they're holding off talking about layoffs until a later date, right? Which means they're not going to lay one off. They're going to reallocate them somewhere else, and all the savings are going to disappear. At every turn, the prison guard union, public sector unions outmaneuver the private prisons. When they go head to head, the private prisons lose every single time. Not to mention the fact that the legislators themselves have strong incentives to keep things tough. As I'm almost out of time, I'll give one clear example of the way in which the public sector cares in a way you can't even see. Outside of 4 states, including this one, the census. Where does a prisoner live when it comes time for a census? They live where they come from, in the urban county, or they live where they're housed, in the rural county. Outside of 4 states, they live in that rural county. Transferring 1.5 million people, mostly from cities, to the rural areas. In some states, that keeps your seat. There are 5 or 6 state senators in Pennsylvania who, if they lost their prisons, would lose their seats to redistricting. All right? There's one small town district in Iowa, the worst case. Most districts have 1,500 people per district. This one has a prison and 40 people. The alderman for that district wins with 2 votes every year, right? Because 1,000 people in this district can't vote in a 1,500-person district. Don't oversell it, right? In New York State, the largest prison is 3,000 people, and an alderman's district is 150,000, plus we don't count that way in New York anymore. We're one of 4 states that doesn't. But you have to realize that there's all these insidious ways in which the public sector plays a much bigger role. So with those depressing comments, I will stop. There are solutions to all these things, but you should realize that we don't actually talk about them at all, and that's a huge problem that we face.